In our Plant Science Conversation series, the Garden's leadership engages in casual discussions with fascinating plant science researchers. Today, Dr. Andrea Weeks and Dr. Morgan Gostel will be in conversation with our Executive Director, Dr. Susan Pell, to discuss their research on plants in the frankincense and myrrh family. Dr. Andrea Weeks is an associate professor at George Mason University, where she is also the director of the Ted R. Bradley Herbarium. Her research focuses on the evolution of flowering plants, specifically those in the frankincense and myrrh family. Dr. Morgan Gostel is a research botanist at the Botanical Research Institute of Texas. His research focuses on understanding plant relationships and evolutionary history, specifically within the aster family and the frankincense and myrrh family. Botanist, educator, and executive director of the U.S. Botanic Garden, Dr. Susan Pell has traveled the world collecting plants for scientific study. Using her expertise, Susan shares with people the awesomeness of plants every day. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks so much, Grace, and thank you so much, Morgan and Andrea, for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk about Burseraceae. The three of us have known each other for quite some time because our research paths cross in many ways, and that we study two plant families that are each other's closest relatives, the Anacardiaceae that I study, cashew family, and of course the Burseraceae, the frankincense and myrrh family that we're here to talk about today. And I really want to start by talking about how and why Burseraceae are connected to the winter holidays and what are frankincense and myrrh. Andrea, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm really happy to be talking with you today. The family is a very large one. There are many more species than just frankincense and myrrh. It is a family of about 700 species and 19 genera that are distributed pantropically.
Very cool. And here's a picture maybe can get us started talking a little bit about what frankincense and myrrh are.
And Morgan, step in here if you want to add here. So what you see in this photo are oleoresins that are leaking out of the vascular tissue just right underneath the bark of this cut stem. In this case, this is a cut stem of Commiphora, which is the myrrh genus. And in most of this genera within Burseraceae produce this compound. And it is harvested by scoring the bark or wounding the bark. This exudate leaks out, it is collected, and then it is either dried down to sort of a sticky substance or a crumbly substance that is then harvested and used locally or sometimes sold on the international market.
So you mentioned what it is about this family that most people associate it with, the holiday season. And I think for most everyone in the world, the first thing that comes to mind, the image that comes to mind when they think of frankincense and myrrh is, of course, the gift of the three kings to the Christ child. So this is a powerful image, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And obviously this has some great significance. It reflects the importance, the cultural importance, and the value that was placed on these materials at this time. And to think of these somewhat mysterious plant-derived elements of frankincense and myrrh grouped together with something that we now value so highly as gold often leads to many questions among colleagues of mine and friends and family. Well, what is it about frankincense and myrrh that makes them so valuable? And so they are these exudates that are harvested through this process by tapping. And Andrea has some wonderful photos here that illustrate how this process works. So typically the bark of these trees or shrubs is scored. So it's cut into all around the base of the trunk. And over maybe a period of a week or 2 weeks, the tree is then left to exude this resin. It slowly seeps out. And as it does, it thickens and aggregates along the side of the trunk. And when you return to these trees that have been scored or cut or tapped, and maybe 2 weeks later, you can harvest that just by cutting it off And then you have this almost rock-like, and I have some sort of show and tell here, hardened resin that can then be used, crushed into a powder. It can be distilled. It can be heated up and steamed to separate essential oils that are used in many perfumes. This is used as a base for many perfumes. And a lot of people don't realize that the harvesting of resin in a similar fashion is used all over the world for products that we consume every day. Maybe not in Burseraceae, but if you look on the back of any food that you might consume, you're probably going to see something that says gum arabic. And this is a similar resin that is harvested in a similar way. So we're actually consuming and using products that are like this on a daily basis, with often not even realizing it.
So I want to clarify one thing for some of our listeners who might not be familiar with oleoresins or exudate. The stuff that we're talking about here is really the sap that comes out of a plant when you injure it. So if you snap off of a cherry twig, there'll be some exudate that comes out of that sap, that kind of sticky stuff that comes out is what we're talking about here. And something that I often say when I give tours at the U.S. Botanic Garden of some of our Burseraceae plants is, why are these things so valuable? Why were they so valuable at that time? And we think about, modern embalming and sort of modern techniques for sanitation that really didn't exist at that time. And the importance of being able to have a very fragrant, very strong smell that smelled really pleasant in these, sometimes small spaces, like for church ceremonies, et cetera, was really, really valuable, right? So having this wonderful scents. And Andrea, you commented earlier that, frankincense and myrrh are kind of the most well-known, probably globally, of the Burseraceae incense or saps that are used for incense. I'm wondering, though, you mentioned earlier there many others are used as well. Do you want to comment a little bit about that and maybe a little bit about the diversity of the family?
So in all major 3 tropical regions on the planet, the people, the cultures who have developed around these species use them in very similar ways. So in the Americas, particularly Mexico, Mesoamerica, but also in South America, the genus Proteum and the genus Bursera are tapped there are hundreds of species that are tapped for their resins as well, and used for medicinal purposes, for incense, for lighting, for caulking, for ceremonial uses as well. In Africa, you have the genus Canarium, but you also have the genus Commiphora, which is the myrrh genus. You also have Boswellia, which is the frankincense genus. Commiphora and Boswellia also are found in the Arabian Peninsula and a little bit further westward. In Southeast Asia, there are a number of genera. The very species-rich genus, the genus Canarium, is used for its resins as well, particularly for caulking, but also for medicinal and ceremonial purposes as well.
And there are other uses of Burseraceae in addition to just the exudate that's tapped, right? Do you want to speak a little bit about that? And I think we have some really great pictures to show.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's the first image? There we go. Oh,
there we go. Yeah.
Okay. I can talk about this one, Maureen. You've got some other ones. So this is
Sure.
the genus Canarium. So this is a predominantly Southeast Asian genus. It's a very large tree, grows in sort of mesic, rain, forest type environments. It has very large fruits. These fruits are consumed by people as well as a whole range of other animals in the forests. Either pressed for their oils, or in this case, the pits of the fruits are cracked open. In this case, you can see a woman splitting these out, and the seeds are consumed. They're very tasty. They're very popular, very rich in nutrients. In the Philippines, they're called pili nuts. You can buy them online. They taste a little bit like a Brazil nut with a little bit of a resinous tang, like a pine nut, maybe. Highly recommend. Yeah, Maureen, why don't you take this one?
So this is a photo of a live fence from northern Madagascar. This live fence, if you can imagine, each of these, they look like trees because they are. Each of them are Commiphora, myrrh. And in this live fence, there are actually 3 different species. And one of them, this is a sort of funny story, is a species that Andrea and I just described as recently as 2016. So you can see that these trees are often used for live fencing for a number of reasons, but most importantly, because they will root very easily from cuttings. So if you take a large branch and cut it and put it in the ground, it's very likely to root and continue to grow. So this can be great for more or less spontaneous fencing to control grazing livestock, or just identify boundaries. So this photo was taken from the side of the main highway in northern Madagascar, and had to slow down, stop the car so I could go and make a collection of this especially new species in this case. It's quite funny.
Yeah, this is a great shot. And I think living fences are such a wonderful feature in the tropics, really throughout the world. I'd love to kind of turn a little bit and talk about how you all, you each became interested in studying the Burseraceae, sort of how you became fascinated by the Frankincense and Myrrh family. Andrea, do you want to start us off there? We've known each other for quite some time and been collaborating since we were graduate students. And so I'd love to hear kind of how you got started in the family.
Well, coincidentally enough, it was reading a paper about the diversity of secondary compounds that are produced by Bursera. So there's a whole range of chemicals that are found in these oleoresins, and they are not the same from species to species. And so reading about that got me interested in the family, and I realized that there was a lot left to discover about the evolutionary history of the family as a whole, and that was the beginning.
Very cool. And Morgan, you started your work, my understanding is anyway, when you became a graduate student in Andrea's lab. I don't know if you had a prior interest in Burseraceae or not, but would love to hear sort of your launch into studying Burseraceae.
I did. This is a great question. So at the time, in 2009, I was actually in Madagascar for the first time doing field work as part of my master's research. And Andrea and you had both been recipients of a National Science Foundation grant to study comparative evolution between the Anacardiaceae and Burseraceae families in Madagascar. I saw this as a fantastic opportunity for me, as someone who had a very driven passion to understand the floristic diversity in Madagascar, to continue to develop my research and understanding on what it is about Madagascar that makes this island such a natural laboratory for understanding evolution, especially evolution of plant diversity. And I'm a native of Virginia, so I was able to pursue my PhD near my hometown in Fairfax. And I couldn't imagine a cooler family to study than Burseraceae, because it's obviously so charismatic. It's such a beautiful family, and it's also so poorly known. For example, we think of myrrh and frankincense as a single thing, right? Well, at Boswellia, the genus that frankincense comes from, frankincense is actually harvested from 4 different species, and the genus itself includes 24 species. Commiphora is, or myrrh, is a genus that contains about 200 species, and almost 50 of those are found in Madagascar. And so to me, this was just a really great way to merge my interests in species diversity, conservation, and understanding the connections, the intimate connections that humans have with plants on Earth.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good segue for us to talk a little bit more about your research and sort of its connections to other fields. So your research, both of you, really, your research on Burseraceae has focused on elucidating evolutionary relationships and really considering those relationships in the context of biogeographic history, ecological environments that these plants are growing in. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your work and the applications of your research in conservation.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that and talk up my new PhD candidate, Betsy Collins, who's working on a project in New World Burseraceae. And specifically, her project is looking at the continental relationships among all populations of Palo Santo, which is Bursera graveolens, and it is one of the major species of Bursera that is tapped for its oleoresins. It has come onto the market within the last 10 years as a very popular essential oil. countries like Ecuador and Peru are starting agroforestry projects to popularize the harvesting and the sale of this forest product. And so Betsy is actually looking at the genetic relationships among as many different populations as she's been able to find from Mexico all the way down to Peru. This species can only be found in seasonally dry tropical forests, which is a very endangered type of tropical forest. And so her work understanding the genetic diversity will not only inform conservation, it will also give us an understanding about how this species has evolved and spread among these island-like forests across the Americas. And hopefully it will also identify some populations that are genetically quite distinct and perhaps warranting recognition as a separate species.
Wow, that's fascinating. Morgan, do you want to talk a little bit about your work? And then I've got a couple of follow-up questions.
Yes, of course. If we could get the photo of the mountain that I think we have in the slide deck shown. Much of my work, as I mentioned, is focused on understanding the diversity of plants in Madagascar. And Madagascar is considered, it's called a biodiversity hotspot, and it's considered one of the hottest biodiversity hotspots on Earth. What this means is a biodiversity hotspot is a part of the world with a very high amount of species diversity and endemism. That means the species that grow there live nowhere else. They can be found nowhere else on Earth. And not only that, a biodiversity hotspot also has to have a significant amount of habitat loss or threat to that species diversity. And so you have a convergence of both of these things in Madagascar that poses a significant conservation risk to a vast majority of species that grow there. So this is an island, mountain, in southern Madagascar that I visited in 2016. I was in search of a species that had been collected twice, but never since, over 50 years ago. And it had only been collected from this one mountain. It's called Botanist, which means King's Mountain. And we traveled here on a day when our car broke down, actually. And so this was a contingency field trip while we waited for our clutch to be fixed in town. We, as soon as we arrived, saw some family who lived at the base of this mountain, just rural farmers, and had an opportunity to approach them and ask if they knew where one of the species that, in this case, I was interested in collecting grows, or if they knew where we might be able to find it. And as soon as I mentioned the local name, Matambello, one of the farmers looked at me and smiled and said, immediately, come with me. Well, I'll take you right to it. And about 30 minutes later, we hiked halfway up this mountain. And sure enough, he brought me right to two trees, one male, one female, that were this exact species I was looking for. It hadn't been collected for over 50 years. As I mentioned, it's known from nowhere else other than this one mountain. Sadly, this one mountain is not part of a protected area. It's not part of a national park or any other type of protected area, which means that the species, which hasn't even been described to science yet, is at significant threat of extinction. And so this was a big priority for myself to collect. And Andrea and I have just sent it to an illustrator to illustrate so that we can describe this new species as new to science and also perform the conservation assessment that it so desperately needs. So this obviously is a story that is and can be rehashed numerous times all over the world in these biodiversity hotspots. Can be a very tragic story, but I like to think of it as a story of hope for the survival and conservation of these species because, well, in this particular case, this species wasn't just growing there. This local community had tapped it. They were harvesting resin from this species and using it for some unknown purpose. I didn't ask. But clearly this farmer who took me to the species, when he showed it to me and he saw how excited I was, he looked at me and he put his hands to his face and made a motion as though he were smelling the sweet smell of this resin that it had been tapped for. And it was very clear to me that this was an important tree, an important species that has some use. It's not even known to science yet. It hasn't been described. And if we lose this species and if we lose that knowledge, that just seems like I can't think of a sadder story. So I hope that as a community, we protect this species and the thousands like it that are at risk of extinction all around the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. And I'll just sort of put a plug in. I think this is where it's really important for Botanic Gardens to be involved in primary research and working with scientists such as yourselves to make sure that in cases like this, where we have very few individuals left in the wild, that we're getting those individuals into propagation and making sure that we can create more germplasm that would be available for both ex situ conservation outside of the natural environment, but also potentially creating some stock for repopulating some of these areas too. So thanks for sharing that story. And I think that leads well into kind of the next part of our conversation, where people often think about wild harvesting as being sort of the most ecologically sustainable way of us getting food. I know the commercial products derived from Burseraceae, which are mostly exudate seeds and then some timber, are wild harvested. I'm wondering if you can talk about the sort of conception of wild harvesting being, really sustainable and better than commercial agriculture, for example.
I think it's a hypothesis, right? That wild harvesting is more sustainable. In the case of Boswellia, which is the genus that yields frankincense, there have been several studies at this point that have examined the forests in which presumably wild species of Boswellia are being tapped for their resin. And they've been able to document that overharvesting means wounding the trees, which injures them, which can detract from their ability to make fruits and to create the next generation of trees. And they've been able to document this for Boswellia, that overharvesting is threatening the sustainability of that particular forest. People have been able to document this in other ways, like for Brazil nuts, for instance. And so I think this is a nice chance to plug or just to remind consumers of these products. And in some cases, in many cases, actually, they are wild harvested from areas that are very difficult agriculturally. These are, in many cases, marginal areas for agriculture, but these trees do grow very well there and do produce an export crop that is very important to people's livelihoods. So I think there's room here to ensure that as consumers, we're looking to understand if they are sustainably harvested and ethically harvested as well. And this goes for Palo Santo in the Americas. And there are definitely efforts underway. I am not as well-versed in myrrh and frankincense sustainable harvesting outfits, but there's definitely room to ensure that these crops, these wild produced crops, have a future and a long-term future that will support the people for the future.
Thank you so much. And I think, sometimes that those are opportunities to conserve land as well, right? So if they have wild plants that are being harvested on them in a sustainable way, then that's a justification for that habitat not being developed into some other use. So really good points there. We've got some great questions coming in from our audience, mostly sort of around medicinal use. So one specific question is, are there antimicrobial and possibly anti-cancer properties of any of these compounds that we see in the Burseraceae?
Great question. And yes, absolutely. This has been well documented in a number of different species all around the world. Especially, there are three that come to my mind. One is Commiphora myrrha. This is the species that is most associated with the production of myrrh that is used commercially. There's also Commiphora gileadensis. This is a species that is associated with, this is one of the few plants that has one of the few genera that has two distinct species mentioned in the Bible with specific uses. So myrrh includes both Commiphora myrrha, as used as an incense in the Bible, but also the balm of Gilead or balsam of Gilead, which is Commiphora gileadensis. Another is resin that is used extensively in Ayurvedic medicine. This is a species Commiphora whitei, which is locally or commonly referred to throughout much of India as Google gum. And so this is used for a number of different medicinal purposes and has been demonstrated to have anti-carcinogenic, antibacterial, as well as other anti-inflammatory properties. Surprisingly, despite this incredibly long and rich history of ethnobotanical use and medicinal use of these plants, they really remain poorly studied and understood in terms of what it is phytochemically that is conveying these medicinal benefits. So this is an area of research that really could use quite a bit of focus and attention. And this history, this medicinal use of these plants dates back millennia. Some of the reliefs in the ancient temple of Hatshepsut in Egypt depict the transport of living trees of either frankincense or myrrh, we're not sure which, from Puntland, or the land of Punt on the Horn of Africa, we believe, to the temple of Hatshepsut in Egypt. It's quite remarkable.
That's super cool. Very cool. Nice to have that rich history. That leads us really into kind of our final question. You've both mentioned now there's so much we don't know about Bursa raceyi, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's the future of research on this family.
I think Morgan touched on one really important dimension of research that is very understudied, and that is the diverse chemical ecology within Bursa raceyi, and also to understand the constituent chemicals that actually have a physiological effect on human biology. There's a disconnect there. It also ties to the fact that we haven't finished discovering all the species of Bursa raceyi. Morgan touched on some species that have recently been discovered in Madagascar, but the same can be said for what remains to be discovered in the Americas or in tropical Asia. So I think there are known unknowns, and uncovering new species is certainly an axis of investigation that needs to continue. I think there's an immediacy or a real need to work on this now as habitat is being lost. And certainly the chemical diversity, I think it's an axis that I'm very interested in exploring. There's some technical challenges to it, but these plants have been solving ecological problems for over 70 million years, and they have a very diverse phytochemistry that we've only barely scratched the surface in terms of understanding.
Yeah, thanks so much, Morgan. Thoughts you might have on future research in Bursa raceyi?
Likewise, I can't agree more with what Andrea said. I think we really globally need to participate in an almost renaissance of exploration-focused biology and botany that emphasizes collections on the ground in these biodiversity hotspots to understand, collect, and describe the diversity that is in these very threatened ecosystems before it is lost, before that diversity goes extinct. And I think it needs to be done in a way that builds capacity for local communities. If we ever hope to conserve and protect these ecosystems, these habitats, we have to include and involve the communities that are living adjacent to and with these habitats. And so that means training botanists locally, involving local students in the research that we're doing, building resources to help them not only protect the plots of land that are threatened, but also realize benefits from conserving and protecting these habitats, understanding how they can sustainably harvest and coexist with these biodiverse plots of land and habitats, and then also support themselves, their livelihoods, and their communities with these resources. So this is, I think, going to be critical. We're in a moment right now the Anthropocene, which we're being confronted with what is called a biodiversity crisis. And we're losing species before we even know what we're losing. And I look at something like this and I just ask myself, what is being lost that could potentially change the course of human history? And so to me, this is key for what we do going forward. Great question.
Thank you both so much. This was really fascinating. I could talk about Burst Racy with you guys all day, as you know. We're out of time, unfortunately. Grace is going to come in and close us out, but just wanted to say thank you so much, Morgan and Andrea, for joining us today and for the great work that you're doing in Burst Racy.
Thanks for the invitation. I'll come back anytime and talk about Burst Racy with you.
Fantastic.
Likewise, this was fantastic. I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weeks, Dr. Gostel, and Dr. Pell for a wonderful discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And thank you especially to the Friends of the U.S. Botanic Garden for your collaboration on this series.